The legacy of leaving home, long-term effects of co-residence on child relationships by Thomas Leopold. So basically, before I get into the article, I just want to say that in this article, although it doesn't specifically talk about my most focused topic in my personal research, it does very strongly hit on a part that I'm including in my triangle, and that is why I've decided to include it in my literature review. So now basically into the article, this article is basically studying how early on time compared to more late and later home leavers of the parental home differ in the relationships and the relations that affect the parents in later life. And basically, he then goes into talking about the literature review, and he says that there's a large amount of body of literature on this subject, but that there's just a lot of gaps within that literature. He starts off by saying that some of the research on this topic has found that adverse family climates promote early home leaving, and that a more like a good environment, a previously good environment in the home actually promotes children to leave the home more than the opposite effect. They also found that he then also says that other research has found that co-residency, intergenerational co-residency on relations to parents transpire only if the children remain too dependent and lack the ability to achieve that adult status. So basically, young adults who are still very dependent on their parents and are lacking that independence and adulthood of, like, let's say, gaining employment and achieving economic success and educational success, which are things that are categorized under adulthood. So young adults who are lacking this and are not achieving the adult status are unlikely to be among the later leavers. Are more likely to be among the later leavers, and those young adults who are more who are moving towards more of independence are more unlikely to be amongst the later leavers. Finally, they found that research on family relationships over time, and they found that changes brought about by the developmental transitions possibly extend into later life, and that negative long-term effects may be reflected in lower levels of intergenerational contact and support provided by parents. So basically, in the literature review, he says the whole gist of the literature review is that there is a fairly comprehensive large amount of research on parent-child co-residency, as well as the timing and pathways into and out of the parental home. But he says that despite the large amount of research on that specific topic, there's far less known and a big gap in the literature about about long-term consequences of this transition of leaving and entering the parental home, and of staying in the parental home for a long time. And he says that there is an absence of research on the consequences of co-residency for parent-child relations in the later life. So now onto the later life, and that is what he will be examining on his research. In this study, he will be examining how early on time and late leavers differed with respect to intergenerational, proximity, contact frequency, and support exchange in the later life. So now onto the methods. Before I get really into the methods of this thing, it is just important to note that in this article, he does use he does use a life course perspective to guide his research, and basically he uses a life course perspective because this perspective allowed him to provide a lens through which you can view how the experience of intergenerational co-residence and leaving home was carried over into the late parent-child relationship. And he says that through this life course perspective, it allowed him to, in his research, emphasize, the importance of this social, historical, and family context in the shaping of the meanings of the attached life transitions that occur throughout co-residency with the adult child and the parent. He says that through this, because he used the life course perspective, his research has been designed, including within culture, within cohort, and within family controls. So now continuing with the methods for this study, he used the data from the SHAR 2005 study. This is a large panel study representative of the population of age 50 and over in 14 European countries. And the reason he used the SHARE study was because of three main reasons. First, this data offered him comprehensive information on up to the 4 children per family, and included parents' retrospective reports on their offspring's age at the time of leaving the home. It also allowed him to control the shared family characteristics that would be applied in the study. And lastly, the SHARE sample had a large sample, which allowed him to create a number of important restraints within his own, in order to create his own sample for his own study. So in the original SHARE 2005 sample, it consisted of 27,355 family respondents. So henceforth, to 27,355 families, including all individuals who entered the SHARE study in wave 1 or wave 2 and reported on living children at the time of the interview. So then, once he had this original sample, he began to create constraints on the sample in order to create his own sample for his own study. So the first constraint he did was that the families had to have between 2 or 4 children within the home, and this minimum number of 2 children per family was necessary to estimate the fixed effects of the models in his research. Then his next constraint was that he excluded any and all families that reported on children who had never left the parental home. And this was because the estimates of within family variation in the age at leaving home could only be obtained if the information was available for every child in the family. His next constraint was actually removed a big chunk of the sample. It removed 3,161 families, in which the constraint was any families in which the last move out of the child occurred less than 5 years before the interview date. And he did this for 2 reasons. One, the main one being that having the sample with families where the last move out was before 5 years, was more than 5 years before the interview, it kind of it helped address one of the main ideas behind the research, which was to study how previous experiences link the outcomes of later life, and that wouldn't be plausible without this constraint. Secondly, through this constraint, he was able to reduce unwarranted heterogeneity between the siblings by excluding very recent transitions out of the parental home. In the fourth step, he restricted the remaining sample to families with outliers or implausible value on the key predictor variable, which was the age of the child. So basically, he removed any and all families in which at least one child had stayed less than 15 years in the reporting parent's household, and he did this because it eliminated the whole idea of the extension of co-residency that could affect the results, and it also eliminated the potential bias that was introduced by early departures that were most likely associated with family disruptions. Excuse me. He then excluded families in which at least one child was born before 1950, and this was because case numbers in the SHARE data were not sufficient to reasonably compute these types of samples. Lastly, his last constraint removed about 50 families in which they were just missing data on any of the control variables used in his personal analysis. And after creating all these restraints of the original sample and basically constructing and building his own perfect sample subjects, he ended up with a sample that consisted of 6,118 families which comprised of 14,739 parents. And now onto the results of this study. So one of the main findings in this study was they found that the time spent in the parental home during young adulthood increased later lives of solidarity and controlled for shared family factors and a variety of child characteristics. They found that later leavers were those who lived closest to their aging parents and just remained in close contact with their parents, and who were offered more help with those parents and who just had a better relationship. Those were the ones who happened to be the later leavers of the parental home. And they also found one of the other main findings was that previous benefits received within the nest constituted support debts of that adult children were paid in later life. They also found that late leavers were also more likely to be on the receiving end of the intergenerational support by a parent when living within the parental home. And overall, the main finding of this research was that there was a very positive view when examining the extended co-residence of a parental home, and they found that when there is an extended co-residence of an adult child and a parent within the parental home, that has the potential to strengthen and lead to positive effects of intergenerational solidarity in aging families and amongst the parents. And that is basically what this whole article found through this study.